Hello, subscribers. I never really wanted to do a video on Aron Ra because, in my opinion, he is a verified liar and a blowhard. But I also want to have at least one video dedicated to every major atheist YouTuber out there. And with over 300K subscribers, Aron Ra is definitely a major voice out there. In his latest video, he apparently interviews Satan, which seems like someone he is on speaking terms with already. But even though it's only a minute long, I have no interest in that. Instead, I am here to refute that other video, 10 scientific facts misunderstood in the Bible. The Bible is completely accurate in everything it mentions, so I suspect Aron Ra will be begging the question a lot, and most likely taking a hyper-literal reading of some of the passages in order to say they are wrong. Okay, let us see what his 10 facts are. Well, rather than try and react, I just took the transcript and will respond section by section. So in the intro, he just calls Ray Comfort a liar, which is, of course, very ironic. And presumably, he spends the rest of the video trying to prove that. But he does so by presuming his interpretation is the correct one, and that if you disagree, then you must be lying. The video is a response to a video by Ray Comfort, and it should come as no surprise to anyone who has seen Aron Ra before that he does not link to the original video in his description. Comfort's video is about 10 scientific facts found in the Bible, and the first one given is that the book of Job says that the earth hangs on nothing, which is a good place to start. Ra starts by saying the book of Job is not as old as Comfort says, stating it is only 500 years older than the time of Christ, which is just wrong. I don't know what scholars Ra is referring to make this claim, but it is common knowledge that Job is the oldest book in the Bible, and Genesis was written at least 1,200 years before Christ. If I were as dishonest as Ra, this is where I would call Ra a liar. But unlike him, I am willing to give the benefit of the doubt that there is some scholar out there who makes this claim, and Ra is just extremely gullible. Then Ra tries to say, the earth does not hang on nothing, by being hyper-literal and saying, it's falling though space, which, quote, is not nothing. This is a pathetic attempt to call the Bible wrong when it is clearly right. Even if you want to be hyper-literal and say space is not nothing, it would still be true to say that the earth hangs on nothing because falling is not hanging. Therefore, the earth is not hanging on anything, aka hanging on nothing. Then Ra starts telling his story about how he thinks the Bible was formed and claiming contradictions based on his own hyper-literal reading of it, citing Psalm 75:3, an obvious poetic book, and 1 Samuel 2:8, which says, he raiseth up the poor out of the dust, and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among princes, and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he hath set the world upon them. It should be obvious to anyone with grade, school-level reading comprehension that this passage is not claiming. The earth sits on literal pillars. In fact, pillars in general is a common idiom. If I were to call someone a pillar of their community, would Ra think I was calling them a stone column? He then puts on screen 6 more verses he thinks makes his point, but all those verses do is mention the foundations of the earth, which is of course true. The earth does have a foundation. It is just more of a 3-dimensional foundation. The Bible does not describe what the foundation is made of or how it works, only that it exists, which it obviously does. The earth is not crumbling under its own weight. Ray complains that the Bible says the earth does not move, but fails to give a citation for this claim. And I feel confident saying, without looking at the verse, he would have been referring to that the verse in question does not imply that the earth literally stands still motionless, but instead that no man can move it. Then he fails to recognize reference points by arguing. The writers of Joshua thought the sun moved around the earth, which they probably did, but they were of course not wrong, because motion is relative. We can only say the earth moves around the sun based on an objective reference point. But if the reference point is the earth itself, and even more specific, just a small portion of the earth, then it is absolutely accurate to say the sun moves around the earth. He also cites Amos 8:9 in order to say that people did not understand heliocentrism, but that verse is about God causing the sun to go down at noon. It says even less than the Joshua passage. Then Ra says something that by his own definition should make him a liar. He says that the Bible says the sun and moon orbited the earth, and they were both the same size and smaller than the earth and bigger than the stars. But the verse he cites says literally none of that. Then he puts up more verses that do not say what he claims them to say. One of them is not even in the Bible. So it is completely irrelevant. The Isaiah passage is just saying the foundations of the earth again, which is not even what Ra is claiming it to say. The Matthew passage is about stars falling from heaven, but it does not say they fall to the ground, only that they fall from heaven. The Daniel passage is a vision, so it's not meant to be taken literally. And the Judges passage is a song, which may be even less literal than Daniel's vision. This is all pretty bad reading comprehension from Ra, and we are only 5 minutes in. Then Ra cites some biblical scholars who support his view, but of course does not give any reason to believe that these so-called scholars are at all correct in their interpretation. Could there be some traditions that say the earth has physical pillars? Perhaps, but the traditions of men are not looked on favorably by the Bible. Ra ends this section the same way he ends all of them, by implying that Comfort knows about all these verses and scholars, and therefore must be lying. This, of course, begs the question, as it requires Ra to be unmistakably correct in his own interpretation, which he is obviously not. Next, Comfort points out that hand washing was prescribed in Leviticus 15 long before germ theory, and Ra goes off the rails on this one. His whole rant relies on misunderstanding the term unclean, as if it was synonymous with infected, and also not understanding why they were unclean until evening. He also makes a really stupid point of calling the sacrifice of the 2 birds as some sort of magic ritual. This makes no sense. No matter how you look at it, if you think the sacrifice was required for some sort of spell, then what was the spell supposed to accomplish? The man would have already been relieved of his discharge, so it would not have been a spell to cure him. It says, right in the passage, that the sacrifice was for atonement, and atonement is not magic by any definition of the word. As for Ra's misunderstanding of uncleanness and the phrase until evening.
What happens in the evening? Does God think that germs are solar powered and that they just shut off when the sun goes down?
We can look at verse 31 to get the answer. Thus shall ye separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, that they die not in their uncleanness, when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. This is a ceremonial uncleanness that prevents them from entering the tabernacle. As for until evening, think of it like waiting for the water to dry. But again, not literally. This is just ceremonial. And no one goes into the tabernacle after dark, except maybe someone who works there. So until evening just means you can consider yourself clean in the morning if you followed the instructions. Understanding the concept of ceremonial uncleanness can answer all the rhetorical questions that Ra asked in this section. Comfort continues by mentioning how doctors used to wash their hands in still water, which obviously was not good. Ra argues that the Bible doesn't say running water, but living water, but of course living water will not refer to water that has been sitting out or used. Then Ra tries to say that Jesus said not to wash your hands, which again relies on Ra's refusal to understand ceremony. Jesus was not saying anything about germs or poisons. He was talking about ceremonial uncleanness or defilement. And Leviticus 15 did not actually say to wash your hands before eating, which was the context of what Jesus was talking about, so it really is not relevant to the point. Next, Ray mentions Leviticus 17:1, which states the life of the flesh is in the blood. First, Ra tries again to claim that the book of Leviticus is younger than it is. This, of course, does not work out mathematically. The first 5 books were written by Moses, and you can tell just from the genealogies that is much older than the 6th century BC. Judges alone lasts over 400 years, if I remember correctly. Kings and Chronicles covers a period of, I believe, about 400 years. I am a little less sure on that one. And the intertestamental period, that is the time between the Old and New Testament, is also 400 years. So that is at least 1,200 years between Leviticus being written and Jesus. Then Ra gets confused about what it means for someone's blood to be upon them. He thinks in his hyper-literal fashion that it means their blood will literally be covering them. But again, anyone capable of grade school level reading comprehension should be able to understand that it is talking about guilt. And Ra makes an interesting choice to ignore Comfort's point that doctors bled Washington to death, thinking it would help, in order to say everyone always knew if you bled too much, you died.
Long before that, even thousands of years before that, people of every culture, everywhere, all around the world had already figured out that if you bleed too much, you will die.
Up until 120 years ago, people were bled, and many died because of the practice.
People of every culture, everywhere, all around the world had already figured out that if you bleed too much, you will die.
When George Washington became deathly sick, doctors thought that bloodletting would help him. But it didn't.
Everywhere, all around the world had already figured out that if you bleed too much, you will die.
All told, his doctors took out about 80 ounces of blood over 12 hours, which is about 40% of an adult's blood volume.
But if you bleed too much, you will die.
Nowadays, we know that sick people need blood, so we give them transfusions. Rather than removing it, we replace it or replenish it, because blood gives life to the flesh.
Ra does not address the example of doctors trying to remove blood, which directly counters his appeal to common sense. And lastly, he argues that Comfort is wrong about making the connection between Leviticus and using blood to diagnose diseases. Well, actually, he baselessly accused Comfort of lying again, but let's not dwell on that for now. And I unfortunately have to agree here that Comfort oversold his point on this one. Science has indeed proven that the life is in the blood. But that phrase, the life is in the blood, does not imply that you can use the blood to make a diagnosis. Next, Comfort mentions that Isaiah 40:22 means the earth is a sphere. This was perhaps not the best verse to use to describe a spherical earth. You get a circle for sure, but Comfort does not really explain how we know it must mean sphere. And Ra makes a point that the word could have been better translated as compass, and it's actually not a bad point. It doesn't get him where he wants to take it, but compass does seem to work. Everything else Ra says in this section is just garbage. He doesn't even understand the firmament and thinks it is some sort of crystal dome, which the Bible says nothing about it being crystal or even a dome, really. There are just two possibilities for what the firmament is. Either it is the atmosphere of Earth, or it is space itself, either outer space or literal space. I cannot be sure. And he even makes another mistake about when a book was written. He says Daniel was written centuries after 200 BC, which is just not true. That would put the writing of Daniel far after the events of Daniel, which I am sure Ra would love to make that claim. And he also falsely claims that both Daniel and Matthew imply that you can actually see the whole of the earth from a very high point, but neither of them do this. And I am sure Ra is aware of this. Then Comfort claims, unfortunately, that people in Christopher Columbus's day thought the earth was flat. This, of course, is just a myth. People knew the earth was round in those days. Oddly enough, Ra only calls him out on this in text form. He saves his speaking portion for some other nonsense about Columbus committing crimes against humanity, which I am no historian, so I cannot comment further on that. Next, Comfort mentions Psalm 8:8 and the paths of the sea, and how we now know about sea currents. Ra's first point is that the story about the motivation of the explorer who found the sea currents is a myth. And again, I am not a historian, so I cannot confirm or deny this. But Ra's second point is rather interesting because he makes it hypocritically. He says the paths of the sea should not be taken literally. He is all too happy to take pillars and foundations and circles as all hyper-literal. But when the Bible mentions paths of the sea, all of a sudden now it is being poetic. This point is so hypocritical to everything else he has been saying that I cannot even be sure if it is a good point or not. Next, Comfort actually really does oversell his case. He claims that Job 38:35 is evidence of electricity being capable of changing into sound. This is actually really bad, and if you can ignore all of Ra's storytelling and bad framing, he is actually right in his response. This passage is not implicit evidence of what electricity can do. So let's just move on to the next segment. Next, Comfort cites Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, saying that everything is finished, nothing is evolving. And while I agree that nothing is evolving, I think this is a bad example to use, especially without better clarification. Comfort does not try to explain that everything is degrading, which is the opposite of evolution, but more than that, this kind of video is one that should be set on common ground, and the people you are trying to reach with it are most likely people who believe the fairy tale of evolution. So it actually does the opposite of what the video intends to do. And Ra's response is the usual bluster calling Comfort a liar and saying, but evolution real though. But he also misunderstands the first law of thermodynamics. When Comfort called this section the first law of thermodynamics, he was obviously referring to entropy, not that matter cannot be created or destroyed. Ra, of course, tries to then spin it to say the first law contradicts the Bible, which it does not. Next, Comfort starts to explain that the dimensions given for the ark are the best dimensions one would want for such a vessel. But interestingly, Ra immediately interrupts him to say that the flute is a myth, as if that had any bearing on the matter. Surely Ra believes the whole Bible is a myth, so why mention this now as if it meant something? But even if it was a myth, it wouldn't have any effect on the argument. The dimensions of the ark are still the best, and that is the point. The majority of Ra's complaint is that the ark would not work or the flood could not have happened. And he cites other videos he has done as evidence. Since it involves going to other videos that I do not want to watch, I will ignore these false claims and focus on the part that is actually on topic. To this, he has only two arguments. First is the genetic fallacy, saying that the research is somehow invalid because it was done either by or in close relation to creationists, but Ra does not mention any counter-evidence or studies. He acts as though there are but does not provide any. His other tactic is to obfuscate. He complained that the other dimensions tested were either too wide or too tall or too skinny.
Because all they did was try different versions that were obviously too wide or too tall or too skinny to produce what only seems like serious research.
But that is kind of the point. If you test out a bunch of different dimensions, only one of them will be the best, and the rest will be either too wide, too tall, or too skinny, or too something. In fact, even if the ark was not the perfect dimensions, it would still be close enough to be considered scientifically accurate, as opposed to something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the ark is just a cube. Next, Comfort mentions Leviticus 13:46 as giving quarantine procedure, long before quarantine laws were put in place in the 17th century. Here Ra blatantly lies and says the Bible says to cast elemental spells. Obviously, the Bible never says anything about elemental spells, nor are any spells involved in treating diseases. But Ra complains that the Bible does not give treatment option for the diseased, but it should be obvious why that is. When you understand that leprosy in the Bible is not referring to a specific disease, but can refer to multiple different types of diseases, all with different treatment procedure. The Bible is not a medical textbook. It is not here to tell us how to cure diseases, but any advice it does give on the subject will be accurate. Israel either would have or could have had doctors who knew how to treat them. God did not need to tell them how to do their job. He expects us to be a little more self-sufficient than that. Then Ra makes the point that if the Bible had used the phrase bad air, that whatever verses said that would have made it on this list. But since it didn't, Comfort is making fun of other people in the past, using that phrase as an excuse not to quarantine. First, Comfort was not making fun of that thinking. Even if bad air was the problem, quarantine would still be advisable. Second, yes, if the Bible had mentioned bad air in this context, it would go on this list. So what? Just because one certain fact is not in the Bible does not invalidate the ones that are. Then Ra apparently confuses Canadian healthcare with American healthcare, saying, it has you not being helped and dying alone.
Biblical healthcare is no better than American healthcare. This is how it works. You're sick? Get out of here. Piss off. Go suffer and die alone, because nobody's going to help you.
Also missing the point of the part he was responding to, since Comfort was just talking about quarantine, not the whole healthcare system. Lastly, Comfort mentions Job 40:15 to say that Behemoth was a dinosaur. And I am on the fence with this one. Ra gives some good arguments to say it was actually an elephant, though I gather from what he said that they were not actually his arguments, but something he got from some old Earth Christians. The two biggest points of contention, I think, would be the tail, moving like a cedar, and the lying under the shade of the trees. If it is only talking about the swaying motion that a tree can make, then perhaps it is an elephant. But if it mentions cedar to denote size or impressiveness, then it must be a dinosaur. And if a dinosaur really cannot lie down beneath trees, then it would seem to be an elephant. But I do believe that dinosaurs could indeed lie down, so I don't think that point gets Ra as far as he would like. In fact, the diagram Ra shows to make his point has the dinosaur standing up, not laying down. The mention of the nose is also a good point. But Ra does make one bad point on this part, where he claims that being chief in the ways of God means being smart. But he gives no reason to think that intelligence is meant by that phrase. And that was Aron Ra's attempt to debunk Ray Comfort. I did not expect going into this that I was going to be responding to a response, but perhaps that was a good thing, as it kept Ra from rambling too much. Hopefully it will be the last time I respond to Aron Ra, as I prefer to respond to people who can stay on topic and not try and randomly disparage God or the Bible or their opponent every chance they get.
Hold it. Stop the outro. After I had finished writing the script, getting it changed into Data's voice, before I even started editing, I realized that Aron Ra made Ray Comfort's argument for him. So let's just agree that Behemoth was an elephant. Now, watch Aron Ra argue for a scientific fact in the Bible, one that would have fit pretty nicely in Ray Comfort's list.
And Ray didn't mention the verse that says the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. The term stones in this context is commonly considered to be their testicles. Elephants are Afrotherian mammals. One of the traits of that clade is that their testicles do not descend out of the body. So it is entirely accurate to say that the sinews of his stones are wrapped together.
So the Bible accurately records how an elephant's testicles work, when nobody at the time would have been able to know this. One of the characteristics given is that no one can approach the elephant but God. So nobody at this time had killed an elephant. There was no way that the person who wrote Job, assuming it was just an ordinary human and not a Christophany, there is no way that person would have known that the elephant's testicles was in his body, wrapped in sinews. So this makes for a great argument of a scientific fact in the Bible, which the writers would not have known about. Just the kind of thing that would have fit perfectly in Ray Comfort's video. Just the type of thing Aron Ra was trying to debunk. And he's the one who gave the evidence. That is fantastic.